So recently I've been watching Vifam, this mecha show from 1983. I'm not very far through, but so far it's really rad. Kind of a Stand By Me in space with robots. It uses the original pitch document for Gundam as its narrative basis, which is kind of interesting. And it's very 80s. You can see the influence of Spielberg movies from the time. I might do a video on it one day. But I particularly started getting into it in episode 5, because that's when it starts getting into those meaty sunrise anime politics that I love so much. The basic concept of the show is that these space colonists find these planets that seem perfect for human habitation, but there's these stray remnants of alien technology, and things go bad when they're suddenly attacked by those aliens out of nowhere, and they totally overpower them with their advanced technology, and it actually becomes about this group of kids who are separated from their parents, and they're on this ship that's trying to navigate out of hostile territory. That's the basic setup for the show. Anyway, so there's this scene in episode 5 where one of the adult characters finds a leftover military base on one of these colony worlds. And he has a discussion with this colonel on the base who reveals that the humans actually knew that these worlds had already been claimed. They'd even received warning from the aliens in their own language not to colonize them. And I was thinking during this scene, well, I was thinking, I love this shit. You know, this super politically charged conversation in a kids robot show, the really excellent framing of a painting of Napoleon between them, which signals these themes of like conquest and, you know, sort of like overreach and ambition that's probably going to bite the humans in the ass. Man, I just love sunrise 80s mecha politics. But I was also thinking, man, the aesthetics of this are actually really different from how most American space opera at the time would frame a scene like this. Because, like, this is space opera, yo. Like, we've got interstellar travel, we've got terraforming, we've got big spaceships, we got all that high-concept sci-fi stuff. But at the same time, every effort is made to make these characters look as contemporary as possible. Like, if I showed this scene on its own, you could totally imagine this just takes place in, like, 1983. In fact, the Napoleon painting kind of draws our mind back further, right, to the past. There's not, like, some hologram or whatever, it's just a painting of Napoleon. And this is something the show kind of does a lot. There's these big fancy spaceships, but the people operating those spaceships resemble commercial airline pilots more than anything. I really like this. I think it sort of grounds these characters amidst this really ambitious world. Because for as much as this is the far future, for them, to some extent, this is just a job. It got me thinking too that this is kind of a motif in Japanese space opera. In a lot of sunrise mecha shows from the period, the emphasis seems to be on making the military look as contemporary as possible, rather than trying to imagine what they'd look like in the future. And parallel to this, there's this other vibe, where you'll have this like cultural regression. Legend of the Galactic Heroes is probably the best example of this. You have the Free Planets Alliance, this kind of flawed neoliberal state that preaches openness and democracy, but also lionizes military heroism and has its own repression. And hey, they basically look exactly like 1980s America in their fashion. And then you have the Empire, an outright tyrannical state, which maintains this cultural plateau in the style of mid-19th century Prussia. Very specifically Prussia, by the way, which seems to be a recurring visual motif in Japanese anime. There is a historical connection there. In the Meiji period, when Japan began its rapid modernization, Prussia was the government it used as its model. Let's also just point out, this gives LOGH an incredibly cool look. The juxtaposition of space battles with imagery that feels reminiscent of like Barry Lyndon is just an incredibly compelling visual style. It's also one that doesn't really date, at least not in the same way as other sci-fi, because it's not necessarily trying to imagine where our current styles are going to go in the future. It's actually imagining that we would regress towards a past style. I think this is something that Japanese animators at the time were really well placed to play with. There'd been all these shoujo period pieces in the 70s, like Rose of Versailles, and also all those world masterpiece theater animations. Another place where you can see this aesthetic, even before LOGH, is the original Gundam. Zeon, along with having overtly fascist imagery, also features a kind of mishmash of various aristocratic European looks. This has been minimized and emphasized to varying degrees across the behemoth that is UC Gundam. In the original show, I see it as a kind of commentary on how Zeon views itself. A lot of Zeon's naming conventions suggests a liberatory movement, Operation British for example, which is a reference to the Revolutionary War. And in its propaganda, Zeon takes advantage of the real iniquities in the Earth Federation's rule, but in actuality, Zeon's leadership have created their own fascist aristocracy under the Zabi family. The fashion of Zeon becomes a neat way to signal this. I imagine a lot of this is down to Gundam's character designer, Yoshikazu Yasuhiko. He's a huge history nut. Most of his manga work in the last few decades have been these intense historical stories. Fun fact, a few years ago there was this Japanese-Cuba film co-production called Ernesto. It's a biopic about this real-life Japanese-Bolivian man who fought alongside Che Guevara during the revolution. Anyway, Yasuhiko was commissioned to do the poster for the film, and just look at this. How dope is this? Gosh darn. Yasuhiko also directed the OAV of Kazedeki no Uta, an adaptation of one of the first major BL manga. Kazedeki no Uta takes place in 17th century France, and Yasuhiko does an amazing job of the period detail. Anyway, it's not surprising then that his Gundam The Origin makes this whole Zeon as nouveau riche motif really explicit with this scene.
これは本館所蔵品の中でも屈指の名品ギリシャの壺。書かれていますのはケンタウラス。イタリア南部ブルチより出土。
これも贋作だ。観光土産の類だ。贋作以前とさえ言っていい。これは？
はあ、ローマ時代の仮面劇に使われたもので。
これも？
あ、はい。そのようかと。
高かったのだろうな。
はい、それなりに。
宇宙世紀なぞと嘘吹いてみても、我々の歴史はたかだか100年にも満たぬ。だからバカにされる。
所詮はただの成り上がりよと。
There's something self-conscious about Zeon's displays of wealth. There's an anxiety in it, as if to say, we are the elite now. We deserve to be the elite, and you have to recognize us as such. The earliest example I've seen of this whole futuristic historical regression thing is in Osamu Tezuka's Phoenix, in particular in the second volume. The second volume takes place at the end of human history. In this story, humanity once had a huge interstellar empire, but now its various outposts have withered and people live on Earth, underground in two massive superstates. These two states are at constant war. Both have given up control of their governments to powerful super AI, and most of the Earth is a barren wasteland. It's, not the most positive future. Anyway, there's a line in there where our favorite proto-toxic yaoi bishonen, Rock, mentions that Earth is in a cultural decline. People have so little sense of a future that they've begun yearning for the past, even dressing in the outfits of old aristocracy. This is even more apocalyptic than those other examples. It's a societal regression because there's no sense that a future lies in wait anymore. I wouldn't be surprised if Phoenix is sort of patient zero for this motif, but if anyone knows any other examples in Japanese sci-fi, I'd be really curious to know. I do think though that Phoenix is doing something slightly different here than these later examples. It's this very anxious Cold War work. It's like, hey, humanity is probably going to inevitably blow itself up. But it's also like, well, we might also experience this transcendent universal reincarnation. Who knows? Whereas a lot of this 70s and 80s stuff seems to be more about this conflict between a kind of directionless neoliberalism and an aristocratic fascism, and trying to see if we can forge a better system, or if those are really the only two options for us. And it looks pretty cool, and unique, and distinct, and it's probably a lot cheaper to do in animation than in live action. What are some other examples? Glass Fleet, maybe? I should really watch Glass Fleet.